Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Gunter, and I am one of the directors here at Brain Balance Achievement Centers. And I just want to welcome you today to actually a brand new topic for us that we're going to be talking about: nature versus nurture, the impact of environmental factors on brain development. So today we want you to participate in this webinar. I'm going to be asking you some polls, questions, and if you will please answer the questions and interact with us today, that would be awesome. So the first poll question is this your first time joining us? And again, this is a good new topic. If this is your first time, it's the first time we're actually talking about environmental factors and how it impacts brain development. And honestly, this actually really started for me. I've been in brain balance for 17 years. My background's in special education. However, I guess it's been about 12 years ago, we actually put a brain balance in a therapeutic residential boarding school for teenagers. And I actually worked there, lived there for 3 years, working with teenagers, and it was incredible. But what was so interesting is that 100% of the students that we served at this boarding school had experienced some form of trauma, and they were really struggling as teenagers. And so having the brain balance on campus and really working with their therapists, we had 10 therapists on staff. We had a whole school that we worked with. We worked with the direct care staff, which were in the houses where the students lived. So it was a very collaborative program where Brain Balance collaborated with several different professions. And it was incredible. And I learned a lot, and I became really passionate of understanding the impact of trauma and how it impacts brain development, especially in children. So I'm really excited today to be able to talk about this and then also provide hope that we can improve the function of the brain. We can build new connections in the brain. So sure enough, okay, 50%, 53% are new and 47% are not. So welcome back if you've actually participated in one of our webinars in the past. We have several centers that are participating in today's webinar. They're on live. We have Chula Vista, Encinitas, Redlands, and San Diego, California, Wilmington, Delaware. We have Central Florida, Coral Springs, Jacksonville, Naples, Palm Beach, and West Chase, Florida. We have Peachtree City, Roswell, and Suwanee, Georgia, Plainfield, Indiana. We have Overland Park, Kansas City, and Wichita, Kansas. We have Louisville, Kentucky, Oakland County, Michigan, Woodbury, Minnesota, Omaha, Nebraska, Summit and Bergen County, New Jersey, Plainview, New York, Charlotte and Cornelius, North Carolina, Columbus and Cincinnati, Ohio, Wexford, Pennsylvania, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, Farragut, Franklin, Tennessee, Allen, Fort Worth, and Lubbock, Texas, Midlothian and Glen Allen, Virginia, Mequon and Fox Valley, Wisconsin. So these centers are on live. These are their phone numbers. There's also a texting phone number in the chat. If you are near one of these centers, feel free to connect with them and talk with them specifically about your child or young adult that you're concerned about. But today we're really going to talk about early childhood experiences and what is that? What are the experiences? Oftentimes we can talk about adverse childhood experiences, and what those are traumatic experiences, neglect, which can cause a lack of sensory exposure, lack of movement, or toxin exposure. So these are adverse childhood experiences that can occur. Of course, there's many others that we're going to continue to talk about, but there are a lot of symptoms that a child or a young adult or even an adult can display due to the adverse childhood experiences, such as being hypervigilant, such as being hyperactive or having anxiety or depression, having meltdowns, bedwetting, sensitivity to clothing, hoarding, lying, lack of empathy, difficulty having relationships, difficulty with learning. All of those things are symptoms that a child or a young adult can display if they have had some adverse childhood experiences. So here's another poll question for you. Have you or your child been through a difficult experience where, like things that we've mentioned, trauma, being bullied, neglect, toxin exposure, and yet now they have a diagnosis, or maybe they don't have a diagnosis, but they have symptoms that they're really struggling. Because oftentimes we see that children that do have adverse experiences can display several different symptoms that can occur that is also related to that. So all to say that we have so far 68% of you guys are saying yes, and then 33% are saying no. And one thing I will say is that if you are a professional and you are listening to this webinar, please give us a shout out in the chat. Tell us who you are, what you do, because we love connecting with therapists and educators. And please share what city that you're zooming in from. And we have a special packet that we send to professionals. So if you're a professional and you're watching this, throw your information in, throw your email in, and we'll send you a special packet as well. All right, so talking about adverse childhood experiences, we actually have a study. It's called the ACEs study. As you can see, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it is the longest study in human history. And basically, it's done by the Center of Disease Control, where the research shows that there's a connection with adverse childhood experiences with a diagnosis of ADHD and anxiety disorders. Now, the Center of Disease Control has a list of the top kind of 10 ACEs experiences that can cause impact. I'm just going to list a few, but some of them are, of course, obvious ones such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, of course, neglect is actually significantly impactful as well. You also can have a caregiver or a parent that passes away. Divorce can also be an adverse childhood experience. A caregiver or parent having to go to prison. Losing your home abruptly due to like a fire or due to just becoming homeless. So a car accident is another one, a significant car accident. Birth trauma, where there was just significant trauma at birth. So there are several different experiences that a child can have. Some of the other ones are bullying, where a child is consistently bullied. Also, too, another one that, we're just beginning to talk about is the experience of going through COVID and the shutdown that occurred related to COVID. So there's a lot of different experiences that really can impact brain development. Now, the DSM-5 criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD, anxiety, and even attachment disorders, here are some things that a child has to display or a young adult needs to display. So specifically for ADHD, it's inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, symptoms that really interfere or reduce the quality of social, school, or work functioning. Related to anxiety, constantly feeling on edge, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, high irritability, muscle tension, even sleep disturbance. And then related to attachment, it's developmentally inappropriate related to social behaviors, having difficulties connecting. Oftentimes we can see that a child that is struggling with attachment, they can appear behaviorally in one environment really good, almost like a complete angel. And then, sometimes at school, they can just be quiet and docile and just get through the school day. And then at home, it's a mess and they're behaviorally a nightmare and they're having meltdowns and you're having physical aggression and difficulty with eating and difficulty with, stealing and lying and, and that's what you experience at home with that child. And yet at school or in public places, they appear to be okay. So that's something too that you often can see with children that are struggling with attachment, being withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, avoiding being touched. So these are several different things that the DSM-5 looks at, but also too that we see often in the centers at Brain Balance. So here's another poll question for you. My child or young adult has a formal diagnosis. Now, it could be ADHD, it could be generalized anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, sensory processing disorder, another diagnosis, maybe that's not listed, or maybe there is no diagnosis, but you have a child that has experienced some hard things, and yet now you are seeing symptoms that we're describing. Maybe you weren't seeing those symptoms before, but now you are seeing those symptoms. And what we have to think about is that the brain begins to develop in utero. All right. So even oftentimes we work with families that have children that are adopted, and they may have even adopted them at birth. But what we have to remember is that brain development starts in utero, attachment starts in utero. And so even if there's a change in a caregiver, even at birth, that is impactful for the baby. That baby spent 9 months in a womb, listening to certain sounds, listening to the biological mother's voice. And so that is something that can be impactful. So sure enough, you guys say that 49% are diagnosed with ADHD, 19% generalized anxiety, 8% oppositional defiant, 19% sensory processing, 30% another diagnosis, and then 33 saying that you don't have a diagnosis, but you've got concerns. One of the things that we often share is that all of these that we've just talked about are symptoms. They're what you're experiencing as a parent, as a caregiver. They're real, right? You're experiencing it every day. And one of the things that we're going to shift and talk about is, all right, well, how does that impact brain development? And how does the brain typically develop? And then when these experiences occur, how does it impact that brain? So let's start with how the brain typically develops. A healthy brain develops with appropriate sensory exposure, appropriate motor movement, and through environmental and social experiences. So that is how a healthy brain develops. All right, let's dive in a little bit deeper. So here we're talking about all these symptoms that I just described: anxiety, depression, difficulty with relationships, hyperactivity, lack of self-regulation, lack of empathy, difficulty with learning. If you think about all the diagnoses that we've just talked about, it really just lists all those symptoms. But the question is why? Why are you having those symptoms? And what it really comes down to is the way that their brain is developing, their way the brain is processing information. So if the brain has to have healthy stimulation, sensory stimulation, healthy motor development, healthy social and emotional experiences, then that is really critical for optimal processing in the brain or optimal development in the brain. And here's the way the brain develops. For the brain to be able to be connected and synchronized and be able to grow and mature neurotypically, you have to have optimal processing in the brain. Okay. So for optimal processing, that equals an equivalent to a brain that becomes teachable. All right. Because when you have optimal processing, you have optimal cognition, the ability to learn socially and emotionally, the ability to learn academically. Okay. And so how does that brain develop to have optimal processing? Well, one of the first things is we look at is primitive reflexes. Now, primitive reflexes, every baby's born with these reflexes. They facilitate in the birthing process. Okay, they're involuntary motor responses that are present at birth because the brain isn't fully developed. All right. And there's survival reflexes. If you think about if you've ever held a baby in your hand and you put your finger in a baby's hand, they automatically clench to your finger. That's called the palmar reflex. It's a survival reflex. So these reflexes help keep the baby's body temperature, helps keep their heart rate, actually gets their body moving because motor develops the brain. If you actually watch a baby, they should constantly be moving. Their arms should be moving, their legs should be moving. There should be constant movement happening because primitive reflexes get that babies to move because motor develops the brain. So primitive reflexes are survival reflexes. They're involuntary motor movements that are present at birth. And then again, it gets that baby moving and it also allows sensory input. So sensory input is really key for development as well. All right, what a baby sees, what a baby hears, what a baby smells, what a baby feels, all helps develop that brain. And then as the motor milestones start hitting, when the baby lifts their head, rolls over, sits up, crawls for 4 months, stands up and walks, all of these motor milestones are critical because number one, it's actually inhibiting primitive reflexes. So as the baby starts growing and developing in motor functions and growing in development in their sensory systems, then these primitive reflexes should not be active any longer because that brain is growing and developing. And oftentimes we focus in on motor milestones, right? Like, okay, they're walking, we're good. But that's actually not the case. Motor continues to develop all the way through young adulthood. And the best way I can describe this is if you think about playing soccer, okay? And I don't know if you've ever seen 4-year-olds play soccer, but it is really funny, right? They're all in a crowd, they're running down the court or running down the field. There's 2 goals, there's a ball. They don't know that they have teams. They're just running and tripping over each other and falling down and kicking the ball, and they know that the ball just needs to go in one of the goalies, right? But then you get to like a 6 or 7-year-old soccer team. They know they're passing the ball to each other. They know they have teammates. They know that they're supposed to pass the ball to their teammate. Okay. So you start seeing that their motor functions are becoming more sophisticated in the gross motor department. Think about a 9-year-old playing soccer. Now they're starting to learn a little footwork, how to psych the other team out, how to move around other team players from the opposite team, right? Things become more challenging. It becomes more competitive. Then think about a middle schooler playing soccer, high school, college, right? So all to say that motor continues to develop, gross motor functions continue to develop throughout a child's life. You need to have good body awareness. You need to have the ability to physically feel your body. You need to have really good muscle tone because muscle tone is the foundation for processing in the brain. So all to say that when we're looking at optimal development and how the brain develops optimal processing and optimal connectivity in the brain, you have to have strong visual system. You have to have a strong auditory system. You have to be able to smell. You have to be able to physically feel your body. Those are your sensory inputs. And then you also have to have strong gross motor functions. You have to have strong body awareness, balance, coordination. And then even in fine motor functions, right? Where they start coloring and they're fisting with the crayon and they're just scribbling all over the place, right? And the pad that you give them is really big. But then again, as they they become 4 years old and they start coloring in the lines and then they start writing their name, but their name is really really big and it's crooked, but then over time, and they're 7 and 8 years old, their name becomes smaller, their handwriting, their letter formation becomes smaller and more sophisticated, because the fine motor movements become more sophisticated. And here's the thing, you have a bunch of fine motor movements in your eyes. All right, so the visual system and the motor movements of the eyes are really critical. They're really critical for brain development. So all to say, when we want a connected brain is a teachable brain, we want an optimal processing brain. And the way to have optimal processing, there's actually 3 steps. First, the brain has to perceive the input. Okay, so if your child is not perceiving input due to maybe some environmental factors and some experiences, or they're perceiving the input incorrectly, where they're hyper or hypo, that becomes where you can see difficulties related to processing in the brain. So sensory sensitivity or sensory processing can become a problem, right? Where light and sound can become an issue, where they're either hypersensitive or in some cases they're hyposensitive. Perhaps they struggle with clothing. Maybe they don't want to wear clothes. Maybe they need clothing really tight because they're really struggling with feeling their body. Temperature can impact the way the brain perceives the environment. Having crowds and lots of people, food and textures, picky eating, even hoarding of food, that also can be even a trauma response. But all to say that irregular food intake can also be impactful to brain function and brain development. So all to say that when we're thinking about traumatic experiences, when we're thinking about neglect and the lack of sensory exposure, that will absolutely impact the development of the brain. But also there can be over sensory exposure due to environmental factors that can also impact the way that that brain processes. So at the end of the day, you really have to look at how is your child's processing their senses, where is their gross motor function, where is their fine motor function, and do you see any disparities or underdevelopments in any of those areas? Because if you do, then that's definitely a sign and a symptom of an imbalance. Here's another question for you. Speaking of lack of sensory exposure, right? The COVID impact was great for all of us, right? Because all of a sudden our children were out of school, right? They weren't able to be with their friends. We had to have wisdom on, do we go out in public? The wearing of masks and not being able to see people's mouths. Children, especially in the early years, below 3 years old, if they were below 3 years old in 2020, that was pretty impactful for them. That could impact even speech and language. So there's a lot of things that could have impacted because of the lack of sensory exposure that could have impacted overall brain development. And sure enough, you guys are saying yes. 81% say absolutely. I feel like the pandemic has been an impact on my child. So here's where we're talking about related to sensory exposure, either lack of sensory exposure or over sensory exposure. We also have 2 nervous systems that function. We have what we call parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. All right. And just like I talked about the primitive reflexes, these nervous systems are appropriate and they're both needed in all of us. All right. Because when you are in a dangerous situation, you want your body to function more out of sympathetic. When it's functioning out of sympathetic, it means that your brain goes into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And it basically shifts into 100% survival. Either you need to fight, okay? You are running, so you're flight, okay? Or you're in freeze mode, okay, where your whole nervous system really just shuts down, all right? Or you're in fawn where you're just trying to survive the situation. And so you're doing everything you can to survive. I will say that oftentimes in my experience working with several, especially like I shared, teenagers and children for years now, working with children that have experienced hard things, you will see children function a lot out of their sympathetic nervous system because that nervous system initially turned on for survival purposes, and then it gets stuck. And especially if a child has primitive reflexes where the primitive reflexes didn't inhibit and didn't integrate appropriately, primitive reflexes can actually activate this nervous system to go into sympathetic just as a flip of a switch. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But a lot of times we see children function out of sympathetic, and even in times when they shouldn't or they don't need to be. And this is where I really want to encourage parents is that, meltdowns and hitting and having, really hard moments, and your child responding, let's just say, with greater than responses, maybe to situations. I often encourage parents to look at their child as, instead of them having poor behavior or misbehaving, really looking at that their nervous system is dysregulated. Even if it's in a situation that's not appropriate and they shouldn't be having a meltdown or shouldn't be reacting the way that they're reacting that way because their nervous system is shifted into fight, flight, or freeze. And their nervous system is dysregulated. Because typically, a child or a young adult should function primarily out of their parasympathetic nervous system, which is where we call rest and digest. Your heart rate is normal, your body temperature is normal, you're able to deep breathe, you're able to process and reason and critically think appropriately, you're able to absorb the sensory input that's coming in appropriately. You're able to the brain is able to inhibit what's not important and focus in on what is important. Because when you're in parasympathetic, you're in rest and digest, but you're also in a place, or your body and your nervous system is in a place of calm and safety. When a child is in sympathetic, their nervous system is giving them all of the red flags that they're not safe and they're shifting into survival. And that's what's really hard, right? It's really hard when you as a parent are trying to be that safe place, trying to provide a safe place, and yet they're not responding appropriately to that safe place. But all to say, it's due to a dysregulated nervous system. So remember, how can a nervous system become dysregulated easily and quickly? It's one of the reasons is there can be primitive reflexes that are still active. Because even when a child experiences adverse experiences, even if they didn't have primitive reflexes and those primitive reflexes had integrated appropriately and the brain was maturing appropriately, and then an experience happens, the brain will shift into survival and you can actually see primitive reflexes turn back on. And remember, these are involuntary motor responses that originate in the brainstem and they're present after birth. But they're there for early child development and to facilitate in survival. But oftentimes, we see children that have experienced hard things still have primitive reflexes. And that's what also causes their central nervous system to really easily become dysregulated, where they can go from parasympathetic to sympathetic, literally as a flip of a switch. So it's something that we have to really look at when we're having and we're trying to understand why you're seeing the symptoms you're seeing, one of the things we look at is, does your child still have primitive reflexes? Because when there are retained primitive reflexes, it impacts each sensory system differently. It can impact their visual system, their auditory system, and auditory processing and visual processing and visual perception. It can impact their fine motor functions. It can impact their body awareness, which then impacts the brain related to the development of executive functioning skills, where they need to multitask or have independence or the ability to goal set. Or it can also impact their ability to relate and connect to other people in relationships, professionally, socially, with family, siblings, and peers. It also, when a child is in fight, flight, or freeze, of course, it's going to impact their ability to learn at school. It's going to impact their ability to remember things and retrieve information and retain information. They're going to struggle with that focus and attention. They're going to be very hyper vigilant of what's around them. And that brain is constantly scanning the room. An example of a primitive reflex is the Moreau reflex. And with the Moreau reflex, it can impact the development of emotional regulation because, again, it causes that nervous system to go into sympathetic response. So the symptoms you can see are anxiety, inflexibility, emotional dysregulation, sensory sensitivities, because, again, when a child is alarmed and their nervous system is escalated and elevated, noises can become louder, the visual input can become stronger because they're on alert. They're on alert. They sense danger. And here's the bottom line, is what the research says is what really is going on when you have a child that is struggling with behavior, focus, attention, academics, learning, attachment, social skills. It really comes down to a lack of brain connectivity, because the brain is not able to develop when your child is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze. It inhibits development. When their nervous system is functioning out of their sympathetic response, they're not able to feel safe enough, and that brain does not feel safe enough to actually develop. And it was fascinating at the boarding school when we would do assessments and we would look at brain age versus chronological age, because oftentimes where they would have functioning, I'll never forget this one specific story where the teenager was 14 years old. It was a young lady, and she came into the school, and we did an assessment, Brain Balance did an assessment with her, and all of her functioning, it was more of like she was functioning as a 9-year-old in a lot of areas. And so when I went to present the information to the treatment team and to the parents who were participating in her treatment team report and review, as soon as I said that a lot of her scores came back more or less functioning at age 9, the dad sat back and he goes, "Oh my gosh, that was the year her mother died." And again, those are moments that just give you aha moments of like, wow, it can impact brain development. So all to say that if you have a child that is struggling, the root issue of why they're struggling is really boiling down to a lack of brain connectivity. So here's a question for you. Do you see your child, teen or young adult, revert to immature behaviors, emotions when they're stressed, when they're scared, when they're overstimulated? So many times in the center, we'll have parents say, I hear this all the time, like, "Amanda, I feel like there's times I am talking to a teenager or I'm talking to even a college student, like sometimes their verbal skills can be above their chronological age." And they said, I feel like I'm talking to a very mature child. And then there's other moments that I'm experiencing a child that's 2 or 3 years old or 4 years old. The behaviors of a child that throws themselves on the ground, even though they're a teenager or they're a middle schooler or an upper elementary schooler, And yet there's behaviors such as throwing themselves on the floor and having a temper tantrum. Wow. 99% of you guys say yes. And that is often what we hear in the centers, is that there is this, immature behaviors and emotions that come out, in the place where there is the most, where the child is feeling extremely stressed. So we have to look at things from a developmental perspective. We also have to look at things from a hemispheric perspective, because every brain has two hemispheres. They have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. All right. And both hemispheres really need to be balanced and connected, because, like I say, a balanced brain is a teachable brain. A connected brain is a teachable brain. And so here you have two hemispheres of the brain. Now, just for simplicity purposes, left hemisphere is your gas pedal. It's your processing hemisphere. It's your ability to verbally communicate, remember facts and details. It's your logical and linear thinking. IQ is more of a left hemispheric function. It's also about conscious memory, conscious actions. It's also your processing hemisphere, visual processing, auditory processing. The right hemisphere is the brake pedal of the brain. It is your ability to see the big picture. It's your emotional regulator of the brain. It's your ability to read nonverbal communication. It's your ability to physically feel your body. Muscle tone is housed in the right hemisphere of the brain. Gross motor development is housed in the right hemisphere of the brain. It's your emotional EQ quotient. So emotional and social and emotional development is housed in the right hemisphere of the brain. It's also about unconscious actions, unconscious memory. So one of the things that's really interesting is there's a lot of research that talks about unconscious memory and pre-verbal trauma between 3 years old and under, when the child can't verbally communicate, but yet that right hemisphere starts developing in utero. And in the first 18 months, it's really critical. But in the first 3 years, that's really how the child is learning, right? It's through experiences that the child is learning. And so there's an unconscious memory that's taking place related to the right hemisphere of the brain. What happens? The bottom line is that both hemispheres of the brain need to be equally developing. They need to be cross-communicating effectively and efficiently, and they need to be in sync. However, when you have different experiences that can impact development of the right or left hemisphere, it causes an imbalance in the brain. One hemisphere can mature faster than the other. And you can see an imbalanced skill set. And that's where you can see they function really well in certain areas and function really poorly in other areas. And that's actually the root of the problem. It's an imbalanced brain. The stronger our brain connectivity is, the more accurately our brains can process information around us, and that each hemisphere has different responsibilities. All right. So when we're thinking about left brain versus right brain, and it comes to areas of social and emotional development, that right hemisphere is really critical, because it's about flexible thinking. It's about unconscious memory. It's about emotional and social development. It's about emotional regulation. The right hemisphere of the brain is about sensory perception. It's also about, so how does your child, like I said, when we're talking about optimal processing in the brain, the first thing your child's brain has to do is perceive the sensory input appropriately. And that has a lot to do with right brain development. They have to perceive visually, auditorily. They have to tactile, the ability to physically feel their body appropriately. They have to be able to smell appropriately. I talk about smell and the olfactory system because it's directly hardwired to the frontal lobe of the brain. Smell actually is really powerful. It can be really powerful in some areas, though. For example, a child can, and they may not even know why, but they can smell something and it can be an adverse response for them. And they may not even know why, but because of unconscious memory, there could be a smell that's actually connected to a trauma. And so then all of a sudden they're running out of the room, or they're running out of the store, or they're running out of a place. And you're like, what in the world just happened? And they don't even know what just happened, because that right hemisphere is actually responsible for unconscious memory. Left hemisphere is more about conscious memory. It's about processing the senses. So like I said, the brain has to perceive sensory input, right hemisphere. The brain then has to process that sensory input, left hemisphere. And then the brain has to respond to that sensory input. And that's the integrated brain. That's the right and the left hemisphere working together, cross-communicating effectively and efficiently. And so they have to respond appropriately. How many times do you feel like your child does not respond appropriately? That's a sign and a symptom of a disconnected brain. And where is that disconnect? Is the disconnect around their sensory perception, more right hemispheric? Is their disconnect more related to the processing of those senses? Because again, it's very complex, and I'm making it very simple for you, but I want you to understand that there's multiple stages that the child's brain or a young adult's brain has to go through to be able to respond appropriately. And at the end of the day, for appropriate social and emotional development, for appropriate connectivity, or appropriate social and emotional development, you have to have optimal connectivity in the brain. You have to have both hemispheres in sync, developing equally, cross-communicating effectively. Now, here's a lot of resources, and I want to highlight a few things, because I will say that Brain Balance is one of the only programs that really can focus on right brain development. Dr. Alan Shore, he's done a ton of research in social and emotional development, sense of self, sense of being. If you're a therapist, I'm sure you've heard of him. But he proposes from his own studies that early psychological damage of the unconscious system, is equated with the enduring impact of relational trauma. So abuse and neglect on the developing of the right hemisphere. And that's from a book called Right Brain Psychotherapy. But basically what he's saying is that early childhood experiences impact the development of the unconscious system, or impacts the development of the right hemisphere of the brain, which can then impact their ability to connect, attach, and be able to socially and emotionally develop appropriately. One of the things that I also thought is so fascinating, and I'm actually going to read this directly from his book. It says that this balanced hemisphericity structurally underlies a uniquely sense of self. And yet within this dual system, the left hemisphere acts as the conceptual self, while the right hemisphere represents the integrated self. So what that means is basically that means that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere is like sense of self, sense of being. Left hemisphere is, it's good that I'm alive, I have purpose, I have destiny. It's really about the cross communication of both hemispheres that has to happen to be able to have an integrated self. And to be able to have an integrated self, that's where you can optimally be relational with others. That's where you can optimally have the ability to love, the ability to be loved. That's where, again, children can socially and emotionally develop appropriately. So all to say that he really does say that it's important to be able to have both hemispheres of the brain developing effectively and efficiently. And he also says that the right hemisphere is critical for the development of sense of self and being, which is the foundation for attachment. It's the foundation for empathy. It's the ability to have relationships with others. So that is something that is super important. We have a lot of other resources that are listed on this page as well. But all to say that, more and more is coming out on, the research is coming out on the importance of an integrated brain, that is something that is very key and critical for optimal development. So here's a question for you. Are you concerned that your child, teen, or young adult will struggle with any of the following due to experiences that they've went through? Perhaps you're concerned about them launching, graduating high school, being independent, the ability to maintain a job, the ability to go to college, and to be able to maintain independence. Oftentimes children that struggle with anxiety, depression, hyperactivity, inattention, that can be something that can be impactful for their adulthood. Or it could be an impact of academic success, or you're concerned about social and relational skills. You're concerned about emotional regulation, because that's really, at the end of the day, if we have a disconnected brain and we have an imbalanced brain, then that's going to be where you're going to see difficulties in these areas. And sure enough, you guys say 65% of you guys are saying, yes, I'm concerned with all of the above. And that's oftentimes what we hear in our centers, is that this is a big concern. But here's the good news. The good news is we can strengthen brain connectivity. We can improve the function of the brain. It's through the study of neuroplasticity that says that the brain can change. We once thought, now granted, it's been probably 25, 30 years ago at this point, that once a child turned 9 or 10 years old, that's it. The brain is developed. There's nothing you can do. Now, and then they thought, well, it's age 25. That's the magic number. By the time they hit 25 years old, whatever they gain, that's where they're going to be functioning. Well, guess what? Through the study of neuroplasticity, it says the brain can change throughout a person's entire life. We can improve the function of the brain. We can build new connections in the brain. And so that's the hope in this whole story, is that we can improve and strengthen brain connectivity. How do we do that? Well, here's what the research says. The research says that you have to do multiple stimulation simultaneously with increased intensity over a period of time, meaning that we activate their brain through their sensory systems. So their visual system, their auditory system, their tactile system, even through olfactory, smell. So we're activating the brain through their sensory systems, and we're activating the brain through their gross motor systems and their fine motor systems. So remember how I talked about the way the brain neurotypically develops is through their sensory systems, through gross motor, fine motor functions. So that is definitely something that we do, is we have to activate the brain through multiple sensory stimulations simultaneously, all right, with increased intensity over a period of time. It's like the brain is a muscle, and so we exercise the brain for the brain to grow and develop. It needs repetition. It needs stimulation in a repetitious way. And so that's something that is really important. So you can improve the function of the brain. Now, also, we have to look at things from a hemispheric perspective, right? What if we're focusing on the right hemisphere of the brain or the left hemisphere of the brain? We can also do that, where we can get more specific in really being able to strengthen the areas that are weak and really not addressing areas that are already strong. And so that's something that we do at Brain Balance. We have an incredible guide for you guys. I am so excited about this guide. It's probably one of my favorite guides that we have produced and are sending out. So this will come in your email. I think there's going to be a link in the chat, but there are things you can be doing at home. Okay. You can create an environment at home that also fosters positive development. All right. So when we're having to calm the senses and we're having to, get that brain out of sympathetic and get it more into a parasympathetic state, there are certain sounds that are very calming to the brain. There are certain smells like peppermint, eucalyptus, lavender, lemon, pine that can also calm the brain. There's certain colors that also calm the brain, colors like blues, purples, and dark greens. And then also just being able to physically, tactile stimulation, auditory stimulation, smell, all of those are activating the senses, but it's activating the area of the brain that will help calm the sensory processing and the sensory input. This is actually the handout that you guys will receive, and it's really helpful. One of the things I encourage is that I would encourage you to give this guide to anyone that is working with your child. It could be summer camps right now because we're in the summer. It could be grandparents, aunts, uncles. It can be their teacher this coming fall, because it is important for professionals that are working with your child and also family members to understand the stress that your child is experiencing and the stress that your child's brain is experiencing. And so, of course, somebody can be helpful or they could be hurtful, right? And they may be hurtful and not even realize that they're hurtful. So this is a great guide to provide some education on what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then also it provides them some resources of what they can do, that can help support you, in their ability to be able to support you in the challenges maybe that you're experiencing. Now, one of the things that we do look at and we consider at Brain Balance, you might have a child that you're really concerned about, even a young adult, because we actually do have an adult program now where you're really concerned and you feel like, you know what, this makes so much sense, Amanda. Wow, I didn't consider brain function. I didn't consider brain connectivity. I didn't consider right hemisphere versus left hemisphere. Well, what we do at Brain Balance is we look at all these areas. We really look and check and look at, does your child have any primitive reflexes that's inhibiting development of their sensory systems that could be inhibiting overall brain development? We also can really look at and consider, how is your child's brain related to sensory perception versus sensory processing? We also really look at their gross motor functions, their fine motor functions, their body awareness, their balance. Can they physically feel their body? We also look at their ability to read and what are their eyes doing related to reading. The eyes have a lot of insight when it comes to focus and attention. The visual system gives us a lot of insight in controlling impulsivity. And then also too, if they're struggling in learning, it could also be connected to the way that their eyes are tracking. And then of course, we do sit down and talk with you about your journey, what you're experiencing, what are the challenges that you're experiencing, what are the challenges your child has experienced. And then really we want to put a customized plan together where we really focus on strengthening brain connectivity, getting a better integrated brain so that they have a better integrated self. So they're able to socially and emotionally develop, and be able to also academically develop. So that's something that we specialize in at Brain Balance. And that is something that you can call the center, schedule an appointment, take that next step. It's a drug-free, holistic option, where you really can see significant change and you can see your child be able to flourish. I was meeting with a family just the other day, and they've been in the program about 2 months, and they have an adoptive story. Their daughter is adopted out of foster care, and they've done everything. They've tried everything. The mom's actually a therapist. And she said to me, she said, I cannot believe the changes I'm seeing in just her nervous system. She said, just her ability to be calm, her ability to handle change and be more flexible. That anxiety has come down tremendously. She said, I feel like we're seeing before our eyes a brain that's becoming teachable, whereas all the tools that I've wanted to be able to utilize as a therapist, I haven't been able to utilize because her nervous system was so dysregulated. And we were just focused on trying to get her to regulate. And so that's the key. The specialty and what Brain Balance specializes in is creating a brain that's teachable, where that brain can learn and grow, and that we can, that you can actually utilize the tools and strategies that therapists offers, that educators offer, that you can actually see fruit from those types of modalities. So, all to say that next month we're doing a special webinar on the brain and anxiety. If you have someone that that needs to be at that webinar, by all means sign up for it. But the next step is I would just encourage you to reach out to a center, get more information, set an appointment, and just know that there is hope, and that the situation you're in right now doesn't have to stay that way. So I think we have just like 2 minutes left for me to be able to answer some live questions. That's something I love to do at the end, if possible. This was a real heavy presentation today with a lot of information, so we don't have a lot of time for questions, but we have a few minutes. I think we've got like 2 or 3 minutes left. So what questions do you have for me?
Thanks, Amanda. If anybody does want to submit questions, we do have a Q&A box that you can type them in. But a question that we got really early on in the presentation that I thought was great is, does a NICU stay count as an adverse condition?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, what's so interesting is I actually, back in 2018, I actually went to Israel and actually took a tour. The Israeli hospital system was doing research on this very topic, on the impact of NICU related to brain development. Because in a traditional NICU, if you think about it, the fluorescent lights are on a lot. There's a lot of high-pitched noises, which high-pitched sounds is more of the development of the left hemisphere of the brain, versus low pitch and low tones is more of the development of the right hemisphere. And so the right hemisphere of the brain is developing in utero, and the first 18 months, it's very critical, but really the first 3 years, it's also critical. And so what was interesting is that they were finding that children that spent an amount of time in the NICU actually had a higher incidence for a diagnosis of ADHD and anxiety. And so they really wanted to understand why. And so it was fascinating to tour these hospital units, because they started making changes to help. And we actually have seen this now in the States, where they've made changes in the NICU where they're improving the environment, where they're keeping the lights down lower. They're trying to minimize the amount of like high-pitched noises. But it is true, because all to say, a baby getting prodded with different needles and, having all kind of, gear on them, that it absolutely impacts brain development. And so it is definitely something to consider when you're looking at, and if your child's experiencing symptoms, that's definitely something that can be impactful to brain function and development.
Awesome, thank you. Another really great question is, even though Brain Balance is a drug-free holistic program, do the staff coordinate with a student's physicians and other care team if they are currently on medications?
Absolutely. We serve children with medication that's on medication all the time. And we love to collaborate with other professionals, from doctors to therapists. We collaborate a lot with therapists, and of course educators. Those are typically who we collaborate with. But we understand, matter of fact, in some of our centers, we call it who's your tribe, right? Because obviously, especially if you're a family that especially has adoptive children, or you've experienced trauma, oftentimes you need support and you need a support system. And so we want to be a part of that support system. We want to be a part of that team. And we absolutely will collaborate with other professionals and work together. And I've done it forever. And I love it. It's definitely a more rich experience when we're working with a team. So yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. For families who have toddlers under the age of 4, what are things that they can be doing right now to optimize brain development?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question, because you know what, those are our COVID babies, right? And so a few things that I would say. Number one, your mantra needs to be motor, motor, motor. Drive their big motor systems. Allow them to play. Allow them to experience full sensory exposure to all different types of senses. But let them play in the mud, let them play in water, let them experience a lot of those sensory input opportunities that maybe they didn't have early on. So motor is really key. Big motor movements are really key for optimal processing in the brain. And then also, I would say try to minimize screen time. There's a lot of research that's come out. Even the Pediatric Association for Children are saying, that children ages 3 and below should not be in front of screens. So really trying to eliminate, the iPad and reducing screens as much as possible for the younger children specifically I'm speaking to, is really important. So motor, motor, motor is your mantra. Give them a lot of sensory input opportunities and sensory exposure, a lot of creative play, and just try to reduce that screen time and keep them moving. That is really some of the best pieces of advice I can give you.
Awesome. Thank you. To
All right.
wrap up with one final really good question, if a child doesn't have any obvious trauma or adverse experiences in their life, but they're still experiencing some of these symptoms, does that mean that it's just nature, or what's happened?
Yeah, good question. Well, there can be other, other elements, right? There can be a genetic element. There can be, honestly, our environment as a whole can, when we talk about toxic exposure and toxin exposure, that can actually play more into things than you think of. Nutrition is also something maybe to look at, because the things that are in our food, the chemicals that are in our food, so if you are having a child that is struggling, you definitely have to look at some things in nature, as far as toxin exposure, nutrition, and how are they related to nutritional input. And really read labels, and try to be as clean as possible for clean eating. That's something, if you can't pronounce it, that's concerning, right? When you read the label, if you can't pronounce it and you don't know what it is, that's concerning. And so for a developing brain of any child, that's something that's super important, is to really read labels and look at what your child is eating. So, yeah. All right. Well, we are going to be doing this webinar again live tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern and so forth. So if you have family members, if you have friends that you're like, oh my gosh, this was good information, helpful information, I need my tribe to watch this, feel free to send them the link that you signed up with, by all means, and we can get them in tonight at 8 p.m. And thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I want to just encourage each and every one of you. I have so much respect for families that have children that are adopted and have experienced, hard things, because it is a hard journey. But we're here. We want to provide support. and just know that there is hope and that the brain can change and we can improve the function of the brain. So again, thank you for joining us today. And I look forward to maybe seeing some of you guys or friends of yours tonight at 8 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.